June 17, 1944. Dawn breaks through the thick Norman hedgerows near Villers-Bocage, casting long shadows across the Bocage countryside. The air hangs heavy with morning mist and the acrid smell of cordite from the previous day's fighting. In the distance, a low rumble begins to pierce the early silence. Not the familiar growl of German Panzers, but something different. Something mechanical and relentless, like the sound of an entire factory moving across the landscape. The rhythmic clatter of steel tracks on stone grows louder, accompanied by the steady drone of multiple engines working in perfect synchronization. Oberst Heinrich Müller of the 12th SS Panzer Division adjusts his field glasses and peers through the hedgerow. What he sees makes him pause. Column after column of olive-green tanks stretch beyond the horizon, their angular silhouettes unfamiliar, yet somehow ominous in their sheer quantity. The sound of their approach creates a symphony of American industrial might. Dozens, then hundreds of engines humming with mechanical precision that speaks of assembly lines and unlimited resources. This is not the sporadic rumble of individual war machines, but the methodical advance of mass production incarnate. For months, German tank commanders had prepared for this moment with a mixture of professional confidence and casual dismissal. Their intelligence reports had painted a picture of American armor that seemed almost laughable to veterans of the Eastern Front. The M4 Sherman tank, they were told, was inferior in nearly every measurable way to their own Panzers. Its armor was thinner, its guns smaller, its engineering less sophisticated. The Americans, according to Wehrmacht briefings, were shopkeepers and farmers playing at war with inferior equipment produced by a nation more concerned with quantity than quality. The German Panzer crews had reason for their confidence. They commanded what many considered the finest tanks in the world. The Panzer IV, battle-tested across 3 years of Eastern Front warfare, had evolved into a formidable killing machine. The newer Panther tanks represented the pinnacle of German engineering, sleek, powerful, and nearly impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons. Most fearsome of all was the Tiger III, a mechanical monster that had become legendary among both friend and foe. These were not merely weapons of war. They were symbols of German technological supremacy, crafted with the precision of master engineers and operated by crews who had learned their trade in the brutal crucible of the Russian steppes. The contempt ran deeper than mere technical specifications. German armor doctrine emphasized individual tank excellence, the concept of the Panzer Ace, the idea that superior technology and training could overcome numerical disadvantages. This philosophy had served them well in the early years of the war, when smaller numbers of German tanks had consistently outfought larger Soviet formations. The notion that American mass production could somehow compensate for technological inferiority seemed absurd to men who had witnessed the devastating effectiveness of German steel and engineering. But as the morning of June 17th wore on, something began to shift in the Norman countryside. The sound of Sherman engines grew louder, more pervasive, until it seemed to emanate from every direction at once. The mechanical rhythm that had seemed merely impressive at dawn now carried undertones of something more unsettling: inevitability. This was not the sound of a few elite machines maneuvering for tactical advantage, but the approach of an industrial tide that seemed to have no end. The first engagement came near the village of Le Mesnil-Patry, where elements of the 21st Panzer Division encountered American armor for the first time since the invasion began. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber positioned his Panzer IV behind a stone farmhouse, confident that his 75mm gun would make quick work of the approaching Shermans. The enemy tanks advanced in a formation that seemed almost naive to German eyes, spread out in a line rather than concentrated for maximum impact, moving at a steady pace that suggested more confidence than tactical sophistication. Weber's first shot struck the lead Sherman squarely in the glacis plate. The impact sent sparks flying and gouged a visible scar in the American tank's armor, but the Sherman kept coming. His second shot achieved the same result. It was only on the third shot that the enemy tank finally ground to a halt, smoke beginning to pour from its engine compartment. But even as Weber's crew cheered their success, 3 more Shermans appeared to take its place. Then 5 more. Then a dozen. The sound of American engines had become a constant backdrop to the battle, a mechanical heartbeat that never seemed to weaken or fade. For every Sherman that fell to German fire, 2 more seemed to materialize from the Bocage. The numerical disparity that German intelligence had acknowledged in abstract terms was now a crushing tactical reality. Weber found himself facing not the 3 or 4 enemy tanks his doctrine had prepared him for, but an endless stream of armored vehicles that seemed to emerge from an inexhaustible American reservoir. The technological superiority that had once seemed so decisive began to erode under the weight of simple mathematics. Weber's Panzer IV carried 57 rounds of main gun ammunition, a generous load by German standards, but suddenly insufficient when faced with target after target advancing through the Norman fields. The careful husbanding of resources that had become second nature to German crews, trained to make every shot count in a resource-starved war economy, proved inadequate against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited quantities of everything. As the battle raged throughout the morning, German tank commanders began to experience something that contradicted their fundamental understanding of armored warfare. Individual German tanks were indeed superior to individual American tanks, just as their briefings had promised. Panzer crews consistently achieved better hit ratios, their armor withstood more punishment, and their tactical skills often exceeded those of their American counterparts. But these advantages, which had once seemed decisive, were being overwhelmed by a factor that German doctrine had failed to fully appreciate: the sheer scale of American industrial capacity. The sound of Sherman engines became more than just battlefield noise. It transformed into something approaching psychological warfare. The constant rumble spoke of factories working around the clock, of an industrial base that could replace losses faster than German gunners could inflict them. Each disabled Sherman was not a victory to be celebrated, but merely a brief interruption in an endless procession of American steel. The mechanical symphony that had begun at dawn now carried an ominous message. America was not simply fighting this war with superior numbers, but with the confident assurance that those numbers would never run out. By midday, the nature of German tank operations had fundamentally changed. The aggressive tactics that had served them well in Poland, France, and Russia, the bold advances and coordinated panzer thrusts that had become synonymous with blitzkrieg, gave way to defensive positioning and careful ammunition conservation. German tank commanders found themselves fighting not to advance, but simply to survive long enough to inflict meaningful casualties on an enemy that seemed to view individual tank losses as acceptable costs of doing business. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the fate of Germany's elite panzer units. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which had entered Normandy with 150 tanks, and the confident expectation of driving the invaders back into the sea, found itself reduced to fewer than 30 operational vehicles within a week of sustained combat. The division's war diary, recovered after the battle, records the growing desperation of commanders who watched their carefully husbanded resources evaporate against an enemy that seemed to possess an unlimited supply of replacement equipment. Historical records from the period reveal the magnitude of the industrial disparity that German tank crews were encountering for the first time. Between D-Day and the end of June 1944, American forces landed over 200,000 vehicles of all types in Normandy, including more than 4,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The entire German Panzer Reserve in Western Europe at the time of the invasion numbered fewer than 1,500 tanks, many of which were committed piecemeal and without adequate support. The sound of Sherman engines that had seemed merely numerous at dawn on June 17th represented the advance guard of an industrial machine that was producing more tanks in a single month than Germany could manufacture in an entire year. The psychological impact of this revelation extended far beyond tactical considerations. German tank crews had grown accustomed to fighting outnumbered, but always with the consolation that their individual superiority could compensate for numerical disadvantages. The Eastern Front had reinforced this belief, where individual German tank aces had achieved legendary kill ratios against Soviet armor. But the Americans presented a different challenge entirely. They were not simply numerous. They were numerous and competent, backed by an industrial base that could afford to learn from mistakes and adapt without the constraints of scarcity that had come to define German operations. Captain John Morrison of the 3rd Armored Division, whose Sherman tank had been one of those advancing through the Normandy Bocage that morning, later recorded his impressions of the German resistance they encountered. His memoir, published decades after the war, captures the professional respect that American tank crews developed for their German counterparts, even as they overwhelmed them through sheer weight of numbers. Morrison noted that German gunnery was consistently superior to American marksmanship. The German tanks were better protected and more powerfully armed, and that German tactical deployments showed greater sophistication and experience. But Morrison also recorded something else: the gradual recognition among German crews that their traditional advantages were insufficient against an enemy that could replace every loss and return to the fight with lessons learned and improvements implemented. American tank doctrine, initially inferior to German tactics, evolved rapidly under the pressure of combat. Units that had suffered heavy losses in their first encounters with Panzers returned to battle with new techniques, better coordination, and most importantly, more tanks than they had started with. The sound of Sherman engines became the soundtrack to this transformation. German veterans of the Russian front, accustomed to the sporadic growl of individual T-34s advancing across open steppes, found themselves facing a mechanical chorus that never seemed to diminish. Every destroyed Sherman was replaced not just by one new tank, but often by 2 or 3. American tank battalions that had been reduced to company strength in morning battles returned to full strength by evening, reinforced with fresh crews and newly delivered equipment. The Bocage country of Normandy provided an ideal laboratory for this industrial warfare in miniature. The thick hedgerows that compartmentalized the Norman countryside created thousands of individual tank duels, each one a test of the relative values of quality versus quantity. German Panzer commanders, fighting from prepared positions with superior equipment and greater experience, consistently won these individual engagements. But victory in each small battle no longer translated to success in the larger campaign. The Americans could afford to lose these engagements and still advance, while every German loss represented an irreplaceable reduction in combat capability. Oberst Wilhelm von Hauff, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division's remnants near Comont, wrote in his final report before being captured that the sound of American engines had become the voice of inevitability itself. His division had fought brilliantly by traditional standards, achieving kill ratios that would have been considered decisive in any previous campaign. German gunners had demonstrated their superior training and equipment by consistently outfighting American crews in individual engagements. But these tactical victories had failed to translate into operational success because the Americans possessed something that German doctrine had never adequately addressed: the ability to absorb losses that would have crippled any other army and continue fighting with undiminished strength. The transformation of German tank warfare doctrine began not in staff colleges or high command meetings, but in the minds of individual panzer commanders who found themselves listening to the constant rumble of Sherman engines and slowly comprehending what that sound represented. This was not merely the approach of enemy tanks, but the audible manifestation of an industrial system that had dedicated its entire productive capacity to the creation of military equipment. Every Sherman engine represented not just one tank, but the existence of factories, supply chains, training programs, and replacement systems on a scale that Germany had never attempted to match. The psychological impact of this realization extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. German tank crews had been raised on stories of individual heroism and technological superiority. The idea that superior German engineering and training could overcome any disadvantage in numbers. The doctrine of the Panzer Ace, the single tank commander whose skill and equipment could change the course of a battle, had been validated by years of success against numerically superior enemies. But against the Americans in Normandy, individual excellence was being systematically neutralized by industrial scale. By late June 1944, the character of German tank operations in Normandy had been fundamentally altered. The bold armored thrusts that had characterized German tactics since 1939 were replaced by careful defensive positioning and ammunition conservation. Panzer commanders who had once planned operations in terms of objectives to be seized now thought primarily in terms of losses to be inflicted before inevitable withdrawal. The sound of Sherman engines had become a constant reminder that this was a different kind of war, one where industrial capacity mattered more than individual technical superiority. The Battle of Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944, had initially seemed to confirm German assumptions about tank warfare. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a single Tiger Y tank, had destroyed an entire column of British armor in a matter of minutes, demonstrating exactly the kind of individual superiority that German doctrine emphasized. But even Wittmann's legendary achievement was ultimately overwhelmed by the simple reality of replacement. The British tanks he destroyed were replaced within days. The German resources expended in the battle could not be. The sound of American engines represented something more profound than tactical superiority. It embodied a different philosophy of warfare entirely. Where German doctrine emphasized the preservation of elite units and irreplaceable equipment, American strategy accepted losses as inevitable and built replacement capability into the foundation of military planning. German Panzer divisions were expected to husband their resources and achieve decisive results with limited means. American armored divisions were designed to absorb losses and continue fighting at full strength, backed by an industrial system that treated individual tanks as consumable resources rather than irreplaceable assets. This philosophical divide became increasingly apparent as the Normandy campaign progressed. German tank commanders found themselves fighting not just against superior numbers, but against an entirely different concept of how wars should be fought. The Americans seemed willing to trade tanks for terrain, casualties for time, individual battles for campaign objectives. They could afford strategies that would have been suicidal for German forces because their industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The technical specifications that had once seemed so decisive began to matter less than operational sustainability. German tanks were indeed superior in almost every measurable category. Thicker armor, more powerful guns, better optical equipment, more sophisticated fire control systems. But these advantages were meaningful only as long as German tanks remained operational. Superior armor meant nothing when replacement parts were unavailable. More powerful guns were useless when ammunition could not be resupplied. Better training was irrelevant when experienced crews could not be replaced after being lost in combat. American Shermans, by contrast, were designed with mass production and field maintenance in mind. Their components were standardized, their mechanical systems simplified for easier repair, their logistics requirements minimized. While individual Shermans were indeed inferior to individual German tanks, Sherman units could remain operational under conditions that would have rendered German Panzer formations combat ineffective. The sound of their engines represented not just numerical superiority, but sustainable military capability. The transformation of German attitudes toward American armor was perhaps most dramatically illustrated in the changing content of Wehrmacht intelligence reports. Early assessments had dismissed American tanks as inferior equipment operated by inexperienced crews. By late June 1944, these same reports acknowledged American numerical superiority while continuing to emphasize German technical advantages. By August, intelligence summaries had begun to focus on American industrial capacity and replacement rates, recognizing that the war had become as much about production as about combat. Effectiveness. Captain Heinrich Schultz of the 21st Panzer Division recorded in his diary the gradual shift in German tactical thinking as the Normandy campaign progressed. Early entries express confidence in German equipment and contempt for American military capabilities. Later entries document growing concern about ammunition shortages and replacement difficulties. Final entries, written shortly before Schultz was captured near Falaise, focus almost entirely on the constant sound of American engines and what that sound represented for the future of the war. The Bocage fighting had revealed something that German strategic planning had failed to fully appreciate. America was not simply fielding large numbers of tanks, but was prepared to continue fielding large numbers of tanks indefinitely. The industrial system that produced Sherman tanks was capable of expanding production, incorporating improvements, and replacing losses at a rate that made sustainable defense impossible. German panzer forces, no matter how skillfully employed or technologically superior, were fighting against an enemy whose capacity for regeneration exceeded their capacity for destruction. This realization transformed German tank warfare from an offensive weapon designed to achieve decisive results into a defensive tool intended primarily to inflict casualties and delay inevitable defeat. The sound of Sherman engines became the soundtrack to this transformation, a constant reminder that German tactical excellence was being systematically overwhelmed by American industrial supremacy. Panzer commanders, who had once planned bold armored thrusts, began to think in terms of fighting withdrawals and casualty ratios. The symbolic power of the Sherman's mechanical rumble extended beyond its immediate tactical implications. To German ears, that sound represented the voice of a different kind of society entirely, one that could dedicate unlimited resources to military production without apparent concern for cost or efficiency. The careful husbanding of resources that had become second nature to German forces reflected the reality of a war economy stretched to its breaking point. American abundance, manifested in the endless procession of replacement tanks, suggested a nation that could afford to fight this war without the constraints that had come to define German strategy. By the time Operation Cobra began on July 25, 1944, the nature of tank warfare in Normandy had been completely transformed. The German Panzer formations that had entered the campaign, expecting to demonstrate their technical and tactical superiority, found themselves reduced to desperate defensive actions against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited replacement capability. The sound of Sherman engines had become omnipresent, a mechanical chorus that spoke of American industrial might and the futility of resistance against an opponent that could replace every loss and continue fighting with undiminished strength. The breakthrough at Saint-Lô marked the beginning of the end for German armor in Normandy, but by that point, the real victory had already been achieved through the systematic demonstration of American industrial supremacy. German tank commanders had indeed laughed at early intelligence reports describing American armor, but their laughter had gradually given way to professional respect, then concern, and finally to the grim realization that they were fighting against forces that represented more than military capability. They embodied an entirely different approach to warfare, one based on abundance rather than scarcity, replacement rather than preservation, industrial capacity rather than individual excellence. The final German tank offensive of the Normandy campaign, Operation Lüttich, was launched on August 7th, with the desperate hope that concentrated panzer forces could still achieve decisive results against American armor. The attack began in darkness, with German tanks advancing under cover of night to avoid Allied air power. But even in the pre-dawn hours, the sound of Sherman engines could be heard in the distance, a mechanical reminder that American forces remained alert and ready. When daylight came and the German attack was finally halted, more American tanks arrived to replace those lost in the fighting. The pattern that had been established in those first encounters near Villers-Bocage held true to the end. German tactical excellence could achieve local success, but American industrial capacity ensured that such successes could never be sustained. The Falaise Pocket, where the remnants of German armored forces in Normandy were finally surrounded and destroyed, became the graveyard of panzer formations that had once been considered the finest in the world. As German tank crews abandoned their vehicles and attempted to escape on foot, they left behind not just military equipment, but the doctrinal assumptions that had guided German armored warfare since the beginning of the war. The sound of Sherman engines, once merely annoying, had become the voice of a new kind of warfare, one where industrial capacity mattered more than individual excellence, where quantity had indeed achieved a quality all its own. The transformation was complete. German tank commanders who had begun the Normandy campaign with confident laughter at American equipment ended it with profound respect for American industrial capability. They had learned that superior technology and training could win individual battles, but could not overcome an enemy whose capacity for regeneration exceeded their capacity for destruction. The sound of Sherman engines had taught them that wars were not won by the best tanks, but by the most tanks, backed by the industrial systems that could continue producing them faster than combat could destroy them. In the end, the mechanical rumble that had seemed merely numerous at dawn on June 17, 1944, had revealed itself to be something far more significant: the audible manifestation of American industrial democracy, a system that could mobilize its entire productive capacity for war while maintaining the logistical networks necessary to supply those weapons across thousands of miles of ocean. German panzer crews had not simply been outfought in Normandy. They had been outproduced, outsupplied, and ultimately overwhelmed by an enemy whose greatest weapon was not any individual tank, but the industrial system that could produce tanks without limit. The sound of those Sherman engines echoes still through the pages of history, a mechanical testament to the power of democratic societies to mobilize their resources for the defense of freedom. In the end, German tank commanders had indeed laughed at American equipment, but their laughter had been silenced not by superior technology, but by something more fundamental: the productive capacity of a free society dedicated to the preservation of liberty. The rumble of those engines spoke not just of American abundance, but of the industrial foundation upon which freedom itself could be defended and ultimately preserved for future generations.